Are English teachers in China just losers back home who couldn't find success in their own country, so they go to teach English because they couldn't do anything better? Maybe. That's the stereotype anyway. Where does that stereotype come from? And how true is it or not based on my 7 years of teaching in China? We'll go through that, and then I'm going to kind of categorize the main groups of people that I encountered during my time in China, because I feel like there's a few different groups. It may be different from your experience if you have any in China, but we'll go through what I experienced firsthand, and you guys can let me know. Now, the stereotype I think comes from the fact that traditionally in China, the entry requirements to be an English teacher were pretty low. They are substantially higher now than they used to be, but you used to be able to get a job without even a degree. You basically just needed a teaching certificate like a TEFL or a CELTA or something, which can be got in relatively quick fashion, and if you wanted to, you could pretty much fake those documents as well. So there were a lot of teachers in China who had no experience and no qualifications. Now, back in those days, the pay was a lot lower. I'm talking about the 2000s when I first went to China. Since then, obviously, China's developed a lot in terms of its economy. They're paying teachers a lot more, so I think hand in hand, the requirements for teachers have gotten a lot higher. But I think that's where the origin of the stereotype comes from. Now, when I first started teaching in China, it was jobs in Japan and maybe Korea that paid a lot more. If you took a job in China, you were essentially going for less money, but potentially better living conditions, just in terms of the fact that you might get a bigger place. I had a mate who was teaching in Japan in a little shoebox, whereas I had a big apartment for my first job in China, although I was getting paid substantially. I was getting paid 3,000 RMB a month in small town Hubei in 2005, which is like $370 a month. So I was getting paid nothing in terms of the currency conversion, but I was living pretty comfortably by local standards. Relatively speaking, the market was not offering huge salaries for working in China, not like now where you can generally get paid pretty good money. So what kind of teachers did I encounter? The first group, I would say, and some of these groups will overlap with each other, but the one-year wonder. The one-year wonder are usually people who have just graduated from university and they're looking to travel before they either go get a job or go do some kind of postgraduate studies. I met loads of people like this from the UK, from Canada, from America, from New Zealand, just finished their studies. They want to go see the world. They want to get paid while doing it, so they go to teach in China. I also met a few who had more specific reasons, like some who had like Chinese heritage but were brought up abroad, born and raised abroad, so wanted to kind of reconnect with their roots. And there were some who were just kind of genuinely interested in Chinese culture and language and stuff. But I would say the vast majority of the one-year wonders I met finished university, wanted to go see the world for a year before going back to their own lives. And most of those one-year wonders only stay 1 year, maybe 2 years. They get a bit of the loser tag because they often got no experience in teaching, minimal qualifications, probably studied a subject which has got nothing to do with language or teaching, and they're probably not there to really focus on teaching. The teaching is the secondary aspect for the reason they are there. They're there to travel, they're there to experience life abroad. Teaching is just the kind of afterthought. And often these people are pretty young, in their early 20s. They're going to go out partying, they're going to be social, they might end up having some kind of casual relationships, so they get a bad reputation in terms of not really being there to teach. Some of them are great, some of them were terrible. It is just within itself a kind of real mixed bag. But that is certainly one group that I met, and I would say, from my experience, 80+% of these people stayed 1 year and then went back home. The second group of people I encountered would be the people I would say who kind of like need a change. They had established themselves in whatever country they were from, America, Australia, New Zealand, wherever they're from, Canada, but they were not happy with their job, or they maybe had a relationship breakup for whatever reason. They were looking for a change of scenery, and hey, look, I can get a job in China, I can get an apartment to live in, I can get a nice salary in terms of local standards. I need a change from life. Now, these people maybe get a bit more of the loser tag about them, because they were probably not doing a fantastic job back in their own country. If they were, they wouldn't be leaving to come to China. From my experience, these people likewise didn't have a teaching background, so maybe get a little bit of a bad reputation as teachers. And from my experience, they're a little bit older than your one-year wonders. Usually they're in the mid-20s, early 30s, or even I've met some 40s and 50s who just had enough of their old life, change of scenery, head to China. Many of these people kind of overlap with the one-year wonders because they don't particularly enjoy it in China, and then they go back home. But there's a few of them who would end up sticking a bit longer, somewhat like the kind of one-year wonders who maybe only planned to stay for 1 year but ended up staying a lot longer. The third group I encountered were what I would call like the real teachers. These people were actually teachers back in their own country. So teaching English in China is not a huge change of pace for them, it's more just a change of location. Qualified teachers, been teaching, and usually got higher level jobs with better levels of pay closer to what they would get back in their own country. Some of the people that I met doing that kind of job actually earned like Canadian dollars working at a Canadian school, so they weren't even taking a pay cut to go to China. They were literally getting the best of both worlds, having a overseas salary but the living costs of living in China. And a lot of those people ended up staying for quite a while as well because it's still relevant to the job that they were doing back in their own country. And then there's another group that I encountered I would call like the pre-retirees. Often these people had a pretty established life back in their own country. They had either retired from their job or their kids had grown up. They basically settled in their own country. They had nothing to worry about, but maybe they didn't travel as much as in their youth, and they decided they wanted to kind of see the world a bit. Usually these people were in their 50s, maybe even early 60s. China does have restrictions on the kind of maximum age limit for their foreign teachers, but yeah, I met quite a few of these people, usually at kind of less stressful jobs, less like kind of training center where it's high work hours jobs, more like a university where they can kind of be pretty cruisy. They don't care if the salary is a bit lower. They just want to travel, see the world, meet some new people. So kind of like the one-year wonders, but at the opposite end of the age scale. I don't feel like many of those people were kind of the traditional loser type because most of them already had pretty settled lives, grown-up kids and whatnot in their own country. So I don't know that many of them would have got categorized as losers. But again, the teaching quality of those people is going to vary. And then there was another group when I was teaching there, which is maybe less common now. I would call them like economic expats. Usually those were people who came to China genuinely because the pay was higher. When I was teaching in China, nobody from New Zealand or Australia or America, Canada or whatever was heading to China for higher salaries because, like I said, the salaries were genuinely quite low, but the living costs were low, so it didn't matter. But there were people, mainly from the Philippines where I was working, but also other countries as well, who were basically in China just because they could earn a better living, and a lot of them would send a lot of money back home to their families. Now, since I was teaching in China, they've kind of tightened up the restrictions on who can teach English. When I was teaching there, that was certainly a big thing. There were whole big communities of especially Filipinos, like I mentioned, but other groups as well, who were basically just in China to earn money. A lot of them had teaching backgrounds as well, especially the ones from the Philippines that I met. And then there's a final group that I'm going to call like the lifers. These are the people who stayed in China for 10 years. I mean, I was 7, so I could even be in that group. 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 20 years. They could have come for any one of those initial reasons. They could have come just planning to stay for a year. They could have come basically because they wanted to change of pace. They could have come for the better salary. They could have come just for a teaching gig, which they were already doing. And then they liked it and decided to stay. These people can kind of sometimes get stuck in a little bit of a trap because every year you stay in China is a year that you are working as a teacher, which is a teaching English job in China doesn't count for much when you head back to your own country. Like when I taught 1 year in China, I came back to New Zealand, and the first thing that I got asked in my interview was, so this is your first real job? And I said, well, I've just been teaching English in China for a year. And they said, well, no, this is your first real job. So it doesn't get that kind of much respect. You're essentially being treated as if you weren't really working. It was just like you were having fun abroad. It wasn't a real job. So people who stay long term can kind of be seen to be digging a hole deeper and deeper for themselves, where every year you stay, it is harder to go back home because you're going to be starting from a probably entry-level role unless you can go back into teaching, but often you won't be qualified to teach in your own country. So you've got this kind of nice middle-class or upper-middle-class lifestyle being a teacher in China, whereas if you head back home, you're going to be starting from the bottom of the barrel. So that perhaps is where a bit of the loser's tag comes from as well, that you immediately go to China and you're suddenly middle-class, whereas back home, you're starting at the bottom of the ladder. Is that the full extent of every group that heads to China? No, people head to China for other reasons as well. I knew one girl who was basically in China to preach Christianity. She was kind of doing it on the down low because you're not really able to do that overtly in China, but that was her main reason for being in China. I met another guy who was Canadian, who had a Filipino wife, and they just needed to prove that they'd been living together for X amount of time before his wife could get her Canadian visa. so they stayed in China because it was easier for him to find work in China than the Philippines. So there's loads of exceptions, but from my experience, these are the main groups that I encountered when I was in China. Is it fair to call these people losers? Some of them are losers. Some of them will be alcoholics. Some of them will be there just because they don't want to get a real job 9 to 5 back in their own country, and the teaching hours are pretty cruisy. Some of them get addicted to the kind of, easy lifestyle you get in China as a foreign teacher, which can be true for some of the roles. Some jobs are pretty hard working. So just like everything in life, it's not really black and white that all of these people are losers. There's going to be some losers within that category. There's going to be some people who are great teachers. There's going to be some people who get into Chinese culture and language. There'll be some people who just waste all their money and walk away from 20 years in China with nothing. It's going to be a mixed bag. But the stereotype still remains. You let me know if you think it is fair or not fair, and what your experience was with either friends or family you've had who are teaching abroad, or anybody who you knew who was teaching in China or other countries.